Welcome back to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag, the true story of how a kid who once had nothing, no direction, and no shot built a life worth living. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. If you like what you hear, I encourage you to go back and check out the story from the very first episode. This podcast is about what it really takes to climb out from rock bottom and why that's always possible. I'm your host, Michael. Let's get into it. This is episode 11, Shifting Gears. When I arrived at University of Washington to begin their writing program in Tacoma, I was determined to use the time to finish writing and publishing my book while I continued to maximize all the learning opportunities available to me. I registered for courses in creative writing, playwriting, poetry, narrative fiction, historical fiction, genre writing, and just about everything in between. I truly believed that even if each class only had one useful piece of knowledge, that I could use that to advance my abilities, then it would still be worth it for my time and efforts for what I'd gained. I would spend my evenings writing and working on projects and then catch up on schoolwork and homework in between. And during my AA program at Green River, I had an abundance of friends, and really anywhere I went, I generally made more. So I hadn't really anticipated how hostile the writing students would be in my program at University of Washington. I came into the program with the goal of constant growth. And so maybe I approached those initial classes with more of a transactional intent. I wanted to improve, and I wanted to be challenged. And I thought the other folks were coming from the same mindset. But most of the other writers were suspicious of any criticism in workshops and generally resentful of hearing anything negative about their work. Even soft criticism like, this dialogue here feels a bit canned. Or saying things like, it seemed like the sister maybe was sexually interested in her brother just by how the scene played out. Well, that wasn't really well received by my peers. If you haven't been in a writing program before, the sort of basic structure of most of the classes is that the professor will ask us to write, X length of story in X specific type of genre, and then to bring 40 copies to class and hand them out to everyone. So then we would we would all sit around and read each other's stories, and then we'd engage in this sort of peer review session to just vibe about how the story hit each of us. So the structure was intended to invite criticism, to further refine and develop our work. But God, these fart smellers, man, they just wanted to hear good things about their stories, and would in turn dish out praise to other stories, hoping to get praise back. It was like a fucking kumbaya echo chamber most of the time, where the other kids wanted to be reciprocally rewarded. And so they were cautious of saying anything bad because they didn't want in turn their story to be picked apart when they were up for their chance at review. But that's not how you grow. And I knew that even at the beginning. So I would go to the class and I would hammer out all the wrong shit as I saw it. And then in turn, the entire room, just in the most unrelenting way, would tear into my work. I welcomed the criticism, trust me. But after a point, it turned into folks just being out to get Mike. I was sort of meaningful for me still because my stories improved a bit. But the peer hostility turned so sharp that sometimes it was hard to tell if they were just angry or if their critiques were genuine. And parsing through things like that just made it difficult to really know what to take stock of for, how to improve my story. It would kind of be like taking a piss. Before class, I would hear classmates pop into the bathroom, talking to each other, unaware that I was in there taking a piss. And they would just be like, man, I can't wait to rip into Mike's story today. Like with this sense of glee. And, their intent was to cause me some kind of superficial harm. I was really thick-skinned at that point, and I had already published a bunch of my work. So I didn't cry about it, and it didn't hurt my feelings. But This was like the practical reality of my situation there in the writing program. This was how the writing students generally acted towards me. I had a few friends, but the deck was stacked against me. Meanwhile, I continued to receive financial aid and Pell Grant assistance at University of Washington, but those resources were limited, especially during summers and breaks. So I also worked as often as I was able, doing various jobs and gigs just to keep food on the table for me and Rylan. One of my more memorable gigs was a summer I took a job blueberry farm picking, picking blueberries for a little time. The guy who ran the farm could only pay me minimum wage, which was like $8 an hour, and I was okay with that. I generally, I had originally found the listing through Craigslist gigs, and it was located in the Puyallup Farm Valley. The days were long and hard, but there was this endless supply of free blueberries for snacks. So the perks balanced things out. Most of the days I would strap this big-ass machine, around the blueberry bushes with this big strap, and then I would lay a big basket-style tarp on wheels below the branches, and then I'd turn on the machine, and it would just vibrate rapidly and shake loose all of the berries, and then I would collect them in a tarp below. I would then move from tree to tree like that until I had a sufficient batch of berries to take to the processing area. It was like scratchy work trying to get close enough to those overgrown trees to run the strap around it, but I would just kind of force my body in each time as the branches scraped my arms and legs. And after I filled the tarp, I would load into a cart and then do it all again until my wagon was full. From there, I would head back to the barn for processing and pour the blueberries onto a little conveyor belt and sort the berries for leaves and sticks or any bad berries in the barn. The guy who ran the farm would talk to me about his band that he was in and how he ended up becoming a blueberry farmer. He was kind of an old rocker type of guy. The long, straight hair and the goatee look. He was genuinely kind to me, though. And I sort of felt like he had it all. He ran this beautiful farm. He rocked out in his free time to Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. And he just felt so centered in his place in the grand scheme of things. At the time I would tell him about my big dreams of becoming a writer and how I believed that, if I just do the work, the rest would all fall into place for me. And he would kind of chuckle at me with the sensibility of an older guy who knew that nothing in life was inevitable. But at the time, I wouldn't have agreed with him even if he tried to just tell me that plainly. I was just a big dreamer. My progress in academics had given me this sense of self that wasn't necessarily fully earned yet. I worked there until the season had ended, and he didn't have any more work for me once the harvest was over. But I will never forget that beautiful patch of land, though, and the memory of how enjoyable farm life can be. That stayed with me till this day. I really did enjoy my days on the blueberry farm, and I still miss the infinite supply of blueberries. But after blueberry season ended, I was hired on a landscape truck working for a guy named Dick in downtown Puyallup. I was working on a crew of all Mexican workers who spoke primarily Spanish, so it was really good opportunity for me to practice the Spanish that I'd learned when I lived in Mexico. I really liked the guys I worked with. My primary crew was just 3 of us most days. One of the guys on my crew was named Nick, and he was from Sinaloa, Mexico, and he was just a really gentle guy. And about 10 years my senior, maybe. He wore a mustache and had a really slender build. And he was recently married, and he and his wife were trying really hard for their first child. My other crew member was Kevin. He was also from Sinaloa, and he was sort of our lead, kind of. But he couldn't speak a lick of English, so I had to be the liaison between him and the customers. Kevin was a few years younger than me and sort of a bigger guy generally. And he was both a hard worker and a pain in the ass at the same time. I really liked him, but we would push each other's buttons throughout the workday. He'd worked for Dick the longest, though, and so Dick really trusted him to run the jobs. We would start each morning by loading up our tools and equipment, and then we would drive our truck out and trailer to the various job sites for the day. I always drove the truck. I had a lot of practice backing up a 20-foot trailer from my landscape days. And so, I would drive and they would ride passenger. And we would just ride around the truck and listen to 99.3 or 99.3, the local Spanish radio station. And just enjoy the heck out of each other's company. We had a lot of fun. Our routes were primarily weekly landscape customers, so the work was mostly, mows, blows, trimming, and pruning of trees. We'd occasionally build a retaining wall or do an irrigation project, but most of the work came off of the landscape route. They were fun to spend time with, and I fit in with them well, with time. I would take them on little adventures after work up into the Clearwater wilderness to shoot guns at targets. I won't forget the beaming smiles and bright faces the first time they unloaded the SKS into a handful of clay targets, Guns can just be really fun in that way. There's definitely like a mental catharsis to target shooting, and they all seem to really enjoy it, just as I had. We would crank up corrido music and just swap stories about our lives in Mexico. And I remember driving down one time, we even ran into a porcupine, and I remember Kevin exclaiming with excitement, "Oh, es un oso!" And that's not a fucking bear. We all laughed, but it was a good time. I would go to their fiestas, and I would always be the only white guy, and they would just feed me shots and make me dance. And I went to even Kevin's daughter's baptismo, and I'd never seen so many gifts for a little girl in my life. They were all just really good people who cared about each other. They showed up for each other, and they showed up for their families in all the meaningful ways. The food was always good, the drinks were always good, and the people all just glowed with kindness. I remember they also loved celebrating the 4th of July. They didn't have it in Mexico, and so they would just buy so many fireworks. I don't think I've ever seen so many fireworks at a 4th of July party in my life. They loved America. They loved being here. Eventually, another couple of guys got hired on and joined our route. Alfonso and Ricardo, they were good company too. Alfonso was a dreamer. He had been brought to the country at such a young age, he never remembered life in another place than the U.S., but he still didn't have his citizenship. So he would, frequently worry about getting pulled over or other involvement with law enforcement. I would talk to him through what I knew and try to help him answering questions, but oftentimes I just didn't know how to help, or I didn't have the right answers to steer him based on the education that I had at the time. Every time Dick would hire a non-Mexican to our crew, the Mexicans all kind of gave him a hard time. Not in like a racist way, but just in a, okay, let's see what you can do kind of way. I know the distinction might be missed by folks who haven't worked trade jobs, but it's sort of a standard hazing on any work crew that you join. We had this big ass lawnmower that was kind of hard to operate if you weren't familiar. It had like these squeeze style triggers on each hand, and you would have to simultaneously squeeze each trigger with the same amount of pressure to, make the wheels work properly. And most folks just didn't have a clue. They the new guy would get hired on and talk really big about all their landscape experience. So then we would put them on the big mower and they would just get drug around the yard and crash into the fence or, make a total fucking mess. Most of the gringos, as they would call them, would quit after like a week or less of hard work. And I realized that my Mexican crew respected me and treated me as a friend because I always just stuck around and I didn't mind the hard work and I could keep up with the rest of them, which was a point of pride for me. They would joke that I had some Mexican blood in me somewhere along my family tree. But honestly, there's just this kind of mutual respect that grows from genuinely hard work. And we all had it for each other. But most of the other folks who came through just couldn't hang. I don't know if it was like a work ethic really that made us all work harder. I think it was trained necessity. Like being poor for long enough had taught all of us. We knew no one was coming to help us or make life easier for us. And that no matter what, there was still bills to pay. And jobs were hard to come by and few and far between. Whether you had a criminal record like me or no legal papers, whatever it was, there were barriers that made jobs that were available ones you wanted to hang on to. And so I stuck it out and so did they, and we all grew together and were better or made better by the hard work that we each did. I kept that job for a few years through my undergrad, and I will forever be grateful for Dick for keeping me on and letting me come back and forth depending on my school schedule. Dick is a standout guy, and he deserves a shout out for just being an awesome man committed to creating jobs for folks. So if you're ever listening to Dick, thank you. You're a good guy, and you deserve it. At one point, Nick's wife finally got pregnant. We were all very much celebratory because we knew how hard they were trying. He wanted a child more than anything. Nick lived in low-income housing in downtown Auburn, and it wasn't exactly a great place to raise a child. There was a lot of crime in his particular housing complex, and there were other issues too, like black mold in the units and vagrancy in general. Anyone who's ever lived in trap apartments knows the drill. But in particular, Nick was located in an upstairs apartment. And the residents of the apartment directly below him were heavy smokers. And his apartment would just get filled with cigarette smoke, kind of at a routine or constant basis. The smoke problem was made worse by just really poor ventilation systems in the unit, which were in disrepair and often caused the smoke to just seep right into his upstairs apartment, where his pregnant wife was growing their precious little baby. Nick had tried to contact the apartment management on several occasions, as well as the neighbors downstairs, and no one was willing to help him. He even tried requesting to move apartments, or at least move to a new complex altogether, but the building management had told him he was in a lease for another 10 months, and if he vacated the lease prematurely, they were going to bill him for the entire amount of his lease. They also threatened that they would put a mark on his record, making it difficult to obtain housing in the future. Nick was genuinely afraid for his wife's health, but they were both most worried about the health of the new infant growing inside that they had prayed so long and hard for. I told Nick I would do whatever I could to try and help him. really in any way I could. So I started looking up, some landlord tenant laws, and I found all these different rules regarding standard health and living conditions of rental units. And so I took my time and I typed them up into a formal letter to his landlord citing the various RCWs and laws. Initially we received no response at all. So then I sent another formal letter that said, "It has been 10 days without a response to the dire health issues previously cited." Sort of a dramatic letter. But at that time, the warning seemed to actually get us somewhere. The landlord responded that they would waive his lease agreement and allow him to move to a different apartment or somewhere else altogether if that's what he wanted. So he was able to move and relocate to a safe unit later that week without any penalty or extra financial cost. I remember Nick gave me the biggest hug after it was all said and done in just sincere gratitude. And man, I felt like I really helped him. There's this old saying that goes, "You haven't truly lived until you've done something for someone else that they can never repay you for." And for the first time in my life, I had a taste of that kind of feeling. Meanwhile, I kept at my writing program. I kept publishing stories, submitting my various manuscripts with big dreams in the back of my mind. I had written and completed, completely finished my manuscript and for my first book that I had written. And I spent most of my time at that point really pounding the desk, trying to make something happen. I would just write query letter after query letter, and man, I just get smacked with rejection after rejection. It was the first real time in the 4 years of my education that my sense of inevitability was tested. Suddenly, my momentum felt staggered. And for the first time in my educational life, I felt like I might have fooled myself with overconfidence. It was around 2016, and my short stories were just finding fewer journals to print in. My acceptances were winding down, despite the fact that I was submitting manuscripts and short stories pretty much everywhere. It was just like suddenly, out of nowhere, there was just this big block in my progress. My writing hadn't gotten worse, or at least I hope not, but I couldn't really explain in a tangible way why it felt like there wasn't any opportunities for me. I knew time was running out in my undergrad as well, and I really needed to make a plan for what came next. My writing professor, he liked to remind us students that only about 50 people in the whole world make their entire living strictly writing books, which always surprised me. But he would tell us that we needed to think about really hard what our day jobs would look like while we were writing our fiction or whatever else our hearts desired. It was genuinely good advice, and I appreciate it, but it always stung a little bit. I wanted to be one of those 50 people, really making it. So at that time, there were a few reasonable paths forward. Some students were pursuing librarian roles. Other students were pursuing teaching certificates and degrees. And some were going into industry writing jobs, tech jobs and whatnot, updating websites and user manuals and things like that. I had a friend in particular who shifted his focus to tech writing and user-centered design. By the way of which, user-centered design was one of my favorite classes in college. If you ever have the opportunity to take that course, I would highly recommend it. It's sort of the principle of how to design anything with the user in mind. My teacher would use the example of, have you ever been to a park and you just see how there will be a paved path, but then off to the side, there's another path on the grass cut in by just people skipping the paved path. And that's, the heart of user-centered design as well. It means that where people keep cutting across is where the actual path should have gone, because that's intuitively where your brain wants to move, or the principle of like a door that you're supposed to push having a plate on it, so you intuitively recognize to push on the door, versus a door that's supposed to be pulled having a handle that comes out. And so that principle of user-centered design, shout out to Emma Thompson was my teacher. Shout out to Emma Thompson, my user-centered design teacher. It was one of the best classes I took in my upper level undergrad writing program. I'd sort of hoped anyways by then that I would have published something major, like a story in the New Yorker or the Atlantic, or that I would have gotten a big book deal on my fantasy novel that I'd recently completed and had submitted so many manuscripts for. But none of those opportunities had manifested for me. My pipe dreams were turning into pipe bombs, if you'll excuse the poor metaphor. I had to pivot and make a change. At the time, Nick had stopped by to thank me again in person. His baby was born happy and healthy, and he was so grateful for the work I did helping him get out of his smoke-filled apartment. Seeing his joy was really contagious for me, and I couldn't help but smile too. It was just a great reminder of how tremendously meaningful helping others can be. I thought to myself, well, if there was a path forward that I could carve out where I could, do something like that every day, I would be really content. And so I started looking into law school. It seemed like a long shot for me, but the more I researched it, the more I learned that a big part of being an effective lawyer was being a really good writer. And I thought, well, I'm a good enough writer. What do I really have to lose in giving it a shot? So in the last year of my undergraduate degree, I added a minor in law and policy and started studying for the LSAT exam. The new courses for my minor I added were just a great addition because they were out of my wheelhouse and really challenged my traditional writing course comfort zones. I started taking 400 level classes on international armed conflict, environmental law, all of which were just super interesting for me. Learning about the rules of engagement and Nuremberg and the Geneva Conventions and the shaky structure of international law was all fascinating for me. And I even took an economics course, an upper-level economics, which ended up being one of the most fundamental and important courses in just helping me understand broader social systems at work across various societies. Principles of market equilibrium, I think, had cracked open my preconceived notions regarding the necessity of control and regulation, and shifted even my social axioms towards ones in which a moving pendulum always seeks center and balance. It just made sense that conflicting economic forces were always driving towards a center point where they could both exist, achieving, the highest perceptible rate of exchange and commerce. And that regulation and taxation reduced overall output. And it could be proven by math. It all checked out for me. Law school options for me, though, were limited. My son Rylan had routine contact with his mom, and I wasn't in a position to move across the country or even the state. There were 3 law schools in the state of Washington, and only 2 were regionally proximate to where Rylan was going to school. And I'd made a sincere effort in my life to minimize disruptions and maximize his ability to spend time with his mom whenever she was available. So I applied to Seattle University School of Law and University of Washington. It was Seattle University who sent me an acceptance letter and a scholarship offer, and I gladly enrolled in their Juris Doctorate program to start in the fall. When my time ended, I graduated from the University of Washington magna cum laude. I really wanted summa cum laude, but my Shakespeare professor, Sharkey, during my final quarter was just determined to give me a B. He was one of those real pricks who thought A's were generally unachievable to anyone who didn't absolutely kiss his ass. I remember going to him before his class ever started and asking what sort of criteria would be best to maintain an A so I could stay on track for my summa cum laude. And he was like, maybe you should just take another class. Unfortunately, it was a graduation requirement, and he knew it, and I knew it. And he was a prick, and it was what it was. Literally to this day, my worst professor I've had in my entire 8 years of my academic career because of his self-inflated ego and unwillingness to see the consequences of his subjective grading rubric on years of a student's compiled work. And so it would be, no pun intended, my first B in a long line of A's along the way. And so it really did hurt my final grade. Ultimately, I was also nominated for the President's Award, but I didn't receive that either. Still, after many semesters of earning a spot on the dean's list and several academic awards of high scholarship, I felt tremendously proud of myself for making it that far. I remember the sincere joy I felt walking across the stage the day of my graduation. It was the first time in my life I walked for a graduation, especially since the day I watched all of my peers in high school cross the stage without me. I was, dressed in my cap and gown, wearing my special tassel and cord for my academic achievements. And when my name was called and I took my diploma from the provost, I looked out at the crowd, and I turned to the sound of applause from my family to see my son sitting in the audience, smiling and cheering me on. And in that moment, it felt like everything leading up to it, every hardship I'd ever experienced, every moment of agony and grief and loss, were all worth it just for those 30 little seconds I had on that stage that day. True joy washed over me. It was the first time walking for a graduation ceremony. It was my first time collecting a diploma. And in that moment, it felt like a repudiation of all the failure that had hung over me and hung over my head ever since not graduating from high school. I had pulled it off. I had finally made it. My family met me outside of the stadium, and they all cheered for me and hugged me as I walked up. We all celebrated together that day, as it was a victory for our whole family. I held my son's hand as we walked to lunch, and with each step I felt lighter. All I could hear from anyone was, "You did it, Michael, you actually did it." I went to work for Dick mowing lawns one final summer, and then I was off to law school in Seattle to try to become an attorney. Thanks for listening to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Every episode is another piece of the story, proof that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back up. If this episode meant something to you, share it. Like and subscribe below if you haven't already. And until next time, keep chasing the life you were meant to live.